turn with me there. Actually, this lesson starts there at the very back. We're in like 441 is where it starts. We'll start, the passage is going to be out of the book of James, and most of this last quarter, I guess it'd be quarter's been dealing with wisdom, and we'll start with James today. So it's James 3, 13 through 18, then it skips to James 5, 7 through 12. And James 3 says, "Who is the wise man who endured with knowledge among you? Let him show of good conversation his works and meekness of wisdom. But if you have bitter envying and strife in your hearts, glory not, and lie not against the truth. The wisdom descendeth not from above, but is earthly, sensual, devilish. For where envy and strife is, there is confusion in every evil work. But the wisdom that is from above is first pure, then peaceable, gentle, and easy, and treated, full of mercy and good fruit, without partiality, without hypocrisy. And the fruit of the righteous is sown in the peace in them that make peace." And then it switches over to James 5. "Be patient, therefore, brethren, unto the coming of the Lord. Behold, the husbandman waiteth for the precious fruit of the earth, and hath long patience forth until he receiveth the early and the latter rain. Be ye also patient, establish your hearts, for the coming of the Lord draweth nigh. Grudge not one against another, brethren, lest ye be condemned, and behold, the judgment standeth before the door. Take, my brethren, the prophets who have spoken in the name of the Lord for an example of suffering, affliction, of patience. Behold, we count them which endure. We have heard of the patience of Job, and have seen the end of the Lord, and that the Lord is very pitiful and tender mercy. But above all things, my brethren, swear not, neither by heaven, neither by the earth, neither by any oath, but let ye be ye, and nay, nay, and let's fall into condemnation." If I kind of had to sum up this last one here in two ways, would be, and what James is going to try to get across to people is to practice what you preach and to be patient. And be patient waiting on God. But I think that James is really going to hit at in this lesson today about putting your words into action and demonstrating a Christ-like behavior. And that means a lot more than just talking it. And I think we have lots of phrases in our society that kind of mimic that same statement, but that's something he's definitely going to try to get across in this passage, is just practice what you preach, show it. And I think that he is going to hit at about what teachers are, and that's one thing Brandon taught last week about teachers. But I think one thing that the commentator makes a point is that everybody's a teacher. If you have children, if you teach a Sunday school, or you're a grandparent, kids are watching everything that you do. They're listening to what you say. They're listening to what you say, and then do you do what you say? And I think that even if you don't want to be a teacher, at some point you can't avoid it, and it could be a positive or negative. And especially as a parent, that's to me the ultimate teaching role as a human for most of us, is a parent. And you can't hide from your kids. You can't hide from your family, because they're going to see what you are about day in and day out. Not that you're going to live a perfect life, because that's not possible, but they're going to see if you really believe what you say, and do you take it. And that's what James, I think, is going to get at, because those are the opportunities that we have day in and day out to be a teacher, is when we're being the example for other people. If you turn to 442 on the next page, we'll start there at the top. It said, "It has been said that all of life is suffering." So this idea is not at all shocking. Of course, it's been articulated to me in the context around the world. As Christians, we understand that suffering we experience is a result of sin in general. Some trying to downplay the reality of suffering, but suffering, especially in the form of persecution, is part of the Christian life. In James's day, the limited scope of Christianity shaped the types of persecution. Today, when Christianity is a global faith, persecution differs from culture to culture, and certain African nation Muslim populations have severely persecuted their Christian neighbors. In other locations, official government policy hinders Christian meetings and formation of churches. In the West, it's not quite so clear-cut what constitutes persecution. While we're not being thrown to the lions in the Roman Colosseum or burned at the stake, subtle forms of persecution do indeed exist. This includes social ostracism, which is part of life experience of many Christians, and how we handle this kind of persecution when we encounter it. I was going to make an issue or talk about some of the persecution in other countries, but it's just so extreme. When I started researching, there's a site that you can go to that is a Christian website that talks about the 50 worst countries of Christian persecution, and like North Korea is at the top, China's at the top, some of the Muslim Arab countries are at the top, and it's incredibly severe persecution. India, and I think, remember we had the speaker here that was from India. If you were here, I think it was on a Sunday night, I think that's right. And he spoke about, you're around this dominant other religion and you're trying to practice Christianity, and there's just a tremendous amount of persecution. I even thought about the speaker we had that was it from Peru? Where they spoke, was it the speaker from Peru? I think where they talked about there was a lot of Catholic and even trying to be a Baptist in that area. Even amongst Christian faith, there was some persecution. But it's so severe in some of these other countries. I think that's foreign to us, but I do want you to know, without going into detail, that does exist. If you just search it on the internet about persecution of Christians around the world, it would shock you. And that these people still stand up and proclaim the word of Christ even under that kind of persecution is to me, it's unbelievable. But we have our persecution here in the United States. I'm going to share with you here in a few minutes. But anyway, nationally, it's terrible. In the lesson in context, it says at the beginning of the studies in James, we noted a few themes that run throughout the letter. These themes unite the disparate topics that James addresses. Wisdom is one of the themes, and recall from example that at the outset, the letter James encourages readers to have patience in the midst of temptation of trials. And I thought that was odd too, because that's what the pastor was talked about last Sunday, was testing, or not just temptations. And I will say, every time you come to church, whether it's Sunday school, Sunday night service, Sunday service, you can learn something. I had, I can't even remember, I'm so terrible with names. Pastor Lawing, yeah. His sermon last week, he preached that passage about Christ being tempted, or being tested. And I had always my whole life wondered, why did Satan say, look, I'll just give this land to you? That was so foreign to me, because I thought he had to know that belonged to Christ anyway. I was so foreign, but after his message, I understood what his point was, is that he knew that belonged to Jesus, and it was his. He was just trying to get him not to follow the order and the will that the Father had set that in motion. He was basically, and I talked about it with my wife, you learn something. He was basically saying, listen, it's kind of like if your dad owned a business and you were the son. Don't worry about your dad. Just get him out of the way. You don't need to worry about his timeline. You're the man. You take it. And I realized that was how he was testing the Lord. So, a passage that I had heard taught, read, and preached, I learned something last week that I thought was really important, is just altering God's timeline, trying to do it on your own. And that's something I think we're all guilty of, including me, is I want to do it right now, or I think this needs to be done. And part of this lesson, too, is talking about patience. And your timeline is not God's timeline, and I think Satan, much like he would tempt Christ, would tell you, man, don't wait on the Lord. Just take matters into your own hands. You have the ability to do it. Just don't wait on the Lord. Just do it. And I think that was a reality that is pertinent in everybody's life, is that patience, and that's something including me. A lot of us don't have a lot of. I'd like to see it fixed right now. And that's a temptation I think Satan is going to use a lot in your life, and especially if you have a tremendous amount of abilities. If the Lord has blessed you with a lot of abilities, it's easy for Satan, I think, to tempt you and say, man, you don't need the Lord. Look at what you can do. Look at how much talent you have. And I think that's kind of what he was doing to Jesus, but of course he's going to do it to us in our own little small way. And it's a temptation. And James is going to talk about patience and waiting on the Lord today in this lesson. Looking at the letter 1 there, education, it's just James' last lesson introduces to the teachers, or those masters that were teaching, and the potential teachers amongst first century churches specifically. So even though he proposed extended to the application of all Christians, we wonder, however, if the remainder of James 3 also addresses specifically to teachers and potential teachers, since James does not use the words teachers or masters in the 6 verses. Ultimately, though, such a question is only hypothetical. It's impossible to imagine that these verses only apply to the teachers. And I think he's talking about the religious teachers, because the teaching that you're going to be able to do is your life experience. What you do on a daily basis is going to be the teaching that most of us are going to be able to perform. You know, you may not be put in a position to teach in front of people, whether it's a pastor or Sunday school or something like that, but you're still going to have that opportunity day in and day out. And that's what James is addressing, is that this is across the board for anybody in the Christian faith, that you're going to have to take this responsibility on. And you can choose not to. And you can choose not to do that. And I think it hurts all Christians. I mean, to hear people that go to church, you know, and speak about the Lord, and then you see them in the community or on Facebook or something like that making statements or doing things, I think it hurts the credibility of all Christians. And I think that's a trap. If you ever heard people say you can build something up and it takes forever, but you can tear it down and like that, you know, it just undermine you. And I think sometimes Christians, we do that to ourselves. And people just, you know, they just lap it up on the outside because, like, you know, look and see this, or look and see that. And it's unfortunate, but we have to be cognizant that that's going to happen. On the good teachers, on number 13, it says, by speaking of the one who was the wise man and endured knowledge, he introduces the issue in a confrontational way. So you think you're wise and knowledgeable. James is posing that question. So you think you're so wise and knowledgeable. He seems to ask, and then prove it in a good conversation. The word in the original language, conversation, refers to that more than talk or a pattern of speech. More broadly refers to your entire way of life or your lifestyle. And that's why I said practice what you preach. I think James is saying, listen, you say you're a Christian, you say you're this, then show me. And James keeps coming back to that. Remember, by your works, by how you talk, by how you live on a daily basis. The teacher's pattern of life is a manifest of good works. A teacher must put into practice personally what is taught. We see this idea of matching talk with the way the life repeatedly in the New Testament. The truth of the Christian teaching is verified by the way of life and those who teach it. The Apostle Peter seems equally concerned with this relationship between good works and one's lifestyle. A teacher's knowledge or claims of having knowledge must be backed up by evidence. There is a word for those who say one thing and do another, and it's hypocrite. The word translated meekness carries with the overlapping meaning of gentleness. Paul connects the two words in 2 Corinthians. And I thought, what it's this thing right here where it says what ministers must know. In this passage, what the author talks about is that this pastor that wants to be a pastor goes to the school. You know, he gets a formal education on how to be a minister. You know, let's just say he goes to seminary. Well, he is really good on what I call the X's and the O's of the Bible. You ask him a question about the Bible doctrine-wise, he knows what he's doing. He knows how to talk. He can answer questions. You know, he knows the Bible from a doctrinal standpoint. He gets his first pastor's job and he realizes that's not all it takes to run a church. There's a lot of things they don't teach you in school. And if you have any kind of training or an education, you realize that mine's in teaching. And I realized when I got my first teaching job and they just hand you the keys and say, go at it. And they let you there, that stuff they taught in college, I knew the X's and the O's of what my material was. But actually teaching young people and how to relate to people and how to relate, that's completely different. And what this pastor said is that his practical knowledge was by taking a couple elder members of the church and learning how to work with other people. And he said that, you know, the schooling didn't answer all of the questions. And that was what he thought. And that's true. If you're going to be in a leadership position, you're going to have to learn. And it's always good to have somebody that's been in that same spot that you can talk to. I've heard Pastor Eric say many times when he was a younger pastor, not that he's old here, I don't want to say that, you know, we're almost the same age, so let's not go overboard. But when he was somewhat a little smaller in the tooth, he said he would talk to other pastors about these problems. You know, this is going on in my church. How do you handle that? That's to me, a sign of wisdom is that you realize, you know, a smart person realizes they need help. You know, if I'm struggling with my Christian faith, the smart person is one that says, man, I need some help. I think the person without wisdom is the one that says, well, I'll just figure it out on my own. And that's what James is trying to get you not to do. Is I think part of wisdom is asking for assistance. And I think putting things into practice. Dylan, is my phone over there? Yeah, bring it here. If you look at that bottom here, we're going to talk about earthly wisdom. Here in letter B on number 14, it says envying translates into the word zeal, but in this way it's not talking about the zeal we normally see, like a zeal for life. It says the lesson in this verse uses the portrayed zeal in a bad sense, an attitude toward that crosses over into inappropriate jealousy. That such envy bitter suggests that it manifests itself in anger and harsh speaking. It is conceivable in this context that teachers might harbor envy at another person's gifts. If you flip over to 444, it would result in strife as it had in Corinth. In this case, there's no reason for any of James' readers to glory in their knowledge of their so-called wisdom. Such behavior would seem from the outside to prove their teaching as a lie. Thus it brings in disrepute to the truth, the gospel they proclaim, just jealousy. And that's something that's underlying. You know, Pastor Eric's talked about other preachers sometimes jealous of maybe the numbers in this other church or what they're doing or what this, missing the fact you're serving the same God, that He has a purpose and a place for what you're doing and a purpose and a place for what they're doing. And if another church is growing and doing great stuff for the Lord, I can say easily that I shouldn't be jealous, but surely all of you can see how in many circumstances, because I think the first thing, I don't know about you, I always think then, why are they growing? What am I, remember that I word, what am I doing wrong? Why are we not doing this, this, and this? Why has it not happened? And of course, that can bring jealousy. And we talk about, I think it comes back to the testing circumstances, Satan would use that. Because it starts coming into your pride. Well, if you just cut a few corners and don't do this and this, you might get a few more members in. I mean, I can see Satan posing that question to you. Don't quite do this. You want more members? If you just cut a few corners, you'll get them in. Then you can change them. And before you know it, you're not standing for what you stood for originally. But we're all going back to being tested and being teachers. And again, too, is if Pastor Eric stands by the Bible and the guidelines that are in the Bible, if you cut corners, you're not even doing what you were supposed to originally. And you're not in the will of the Lord. So it goes back. You have to have some wisdom. You know, numbers are success and how we view success. And I always, and I hate to kind of off topic, but, every time one soul is saved, that says heaven rejoices. Well, that shows you how precious one soul is to be saved. If it was commonplace and easy to do, they would just take it as another old day at the office. But the people in heaven do not react that way. That also tells you how hard it is to save that one soul. If it was just so easy, it would be commonplace. We may see it as commonplace, which I think is probably part of our issue, but heaven never sees it that way. At least that's the way that I read it. They never see it that way. I was going to, you're talking about putting words into practice, and I told you I'd looked at some of the other countries that had situations for persecution of Christians, but I want to focus here on the United States and about putting your words into actions, practice on what you preach. And I found this article here about a Washington high school coach. This was maybe a year or two ago. He was placed on leave for praying at the school. And it says a Seattle assistant high school football coach was placed on paid leave for continuing to pray on the field after games, weeks after his school district warned him not to do so. The high school assistant coach is in Seattle, Joe Kennedy, whose suspension Wednesday came on the day after the school's final regular season game, cannot resume his job until he agrees not to pray while on duty as coach, the Bremerton School District said in a letter posted online. Said Kennedy's case made headlines after the district ordered him in September to stop praying on-field post-game prayers, saying his years-long practice could be perceived as an endorsement of religion and violation of the First Amendment's Establishment Clause. Kennedy, who says he has prayed at the 50-yard line after games since he was hired in 2008, initially abided by the directive, but a religious freedom organization asserted he had the right to do so. So he prayed at midfield after the school's October 16th homecoming game. The coach said that prayers are private and that while some students end up joining him, they do on their own volition. The Liberty Institute, a Texas-based group representing Kennedy, said it was sure the school would sue the school on his behalf, arguing the school was violating his First Amendment civil rights. He said, "We have tried to meet with the school's officials in person, but they refused to meet. We were only able to have a brief hour-and-a-half call with their lawyer, and the result was a letter banning private prayer just as a few hours before last Friday's game," the Institute's chief counsel said in a post reacting to Kennedy's suspension. It's unfortunate the school district is choosing litigation instead of a simple meeting. The coach's defiance, Kennedy found himself surrounded by supporters when he prayed on the field after an October 16th game. He cried as he spoke to reporters. He said, "I've got my eyes closed and I feel all these people around me and I'm like, God, I hope those aren't kids," Kennedy told the CNN affiliate of Seattle and other outlets. "I'm sitting there and I'm going, God, thank you for this opportunity. And if this is the last time I step on the field with these guys." According to the Seattle Times, Kennedy, 46, had never asked anyone else to participate in the post-game prayer. The prayer, according to the Times, is a version of the following statement: "Lord, I thank you for these kids and the blessings you've given me with them. We believe in the game, we believe in competition, and when we come in as rivals, we leave as brothers." The district said in a September letter that the coach said that he would still be permitted to speak to members of both teams after games, so long as he didn't include religious expressions or include Christian prayer. In Wednesday's letter, the district said it has offered Kennedy a private location to use for prayer after games, as though not to be seen. But Kennedy declined, he said. Instead, his representatives have clearly stated to me that the accommodation doesn't allow Kennedy his freedom. Sasser of the Liberty Institute has written out that although the First Amendment forbids religious activities that are sponsored by the government, it protects religious activity initiated by individuals privately. Said no reasonable observer could conclude that a football coach who waits until the game is over and the players have left the field and walks to midfield to say a short, private, personal prayer is speaking on the behalf of the state. This is the whole reason of this last paragraph. He says, "Whatever happens, happens, you know," he said to the Patriot Ledger, "but I'm going to be bold in my faith, and I'm going to fight the good fight. And I want to set that example for every one of the kids, is that you do something if it's something that you believe in." I thought that you're talking about persecution of Christians and you want a real life example. There you go. You get somebody trying to be a role model for Christianity, for the Christian faith, and on his own, he just prays the 50-yard after games on his own, and people just join him, and they try to take that away. But rather than just saying, well, this job is more important, or this or that, I'm going to practice what I preach. I think that the Lord's important, I think prayer is important, and I'm going to do it. Now, saying that you would do that and doing that is two different things. Now, I think if James was to read that letter, he would say, that's exactly what I'm talking about. That man is practicing what he's preaching. He makes a statement about how he thinks the Lord is important and that prayer is important, and he's going to stand for the Lord, and somebody threatens him, and he says, your threats are nothing because the person I serve is what's important. And he practiced even to his own detriment. And I just thought that was a good example of, people always ask, are we really persecuted in the United States for our Christian faith? There's your one example. There's a million. I just thought personally, just because his last statement coincides perfectly with the lesson, that he's practicing what he preaches, and he trusts the Lord that whatever comes of that situation, it will work out. And I just think that was something worth reading. If you look at number 16 at the bottom, it says, all of this should be no surprise. Worldly wisdom leads to bad outcomes. In this case, it leads to confusion and every evil work. It says it's damaging to the extreme. It threatens the very integrity of the church. And I think that's what I was talking about, making them bending the rules or cutting corners or doing this or giving in a little bit, which is what I think we have done as Christians for a long period of time. It just hurts your integrity. At the church I was at previously, one thing I was probably most proud of, and I don't know if Eric was involved in this or not. If he's not, that's fine. But the Southern Baptist Association had tried to let people that were divorced and things of that nature have leadership roles in the Southern Baptist Association. And the pastor I work with said, I'm not saying that they're bad people or that, it just happens, but the Lord says you're not in a leadership position, period. There is no discussion. I mean, and if you don't, just read the Bible, it's there for you. And the preacher basically wrote a letter and said, if this is going to be your stance and you're going to cut corners, and one of the leaders of that group had told our pastor, well, it doesn't bother anybody else. Well, I'd say, well, it bothers the Lord, or he wouldn't have made the rule. So to get numbers and participation and get more churches to be part of it, they wanted to cut what we think is one little rule. That's not one little rule to the Lord. And so he just said, if that's going to be a way, then we're going to leave the association. I mean, to me, that's integrity. And somebody says, well, man, you might need their money or you might need their support or whatever. Not at the expense of the integrity of the church. Well, you might offend somebody. You might make somebody leave the church. Well, I don't want them to leave. But if they're not willing to understand that that's the word of the Lord, not my rule, go read it yourself. And if it bothers you, then you and the Lord might need to have a conversation. But, you're not going to hurt the integrity of the church. And I think that and somebody says, well, Philip, just don't get so upset. It's just one little thing. When I was young, people say, Philip, it's that one little thing leads to another and another and another. I remember my first year of teaching, well, it was probably my third year. This older teacher chewed me out. Gosh, she scared me to death. Our insurance had always been free through the state. They didn't charge you for it. And then that first year, they charged $25 a month for your insurance. And these teachers, these older teachers, man, they were up in arms and going crazy. And I said, it's $25. And I said, what's the big deal? That woman said, come here, boy. And I said, uh-oh. And she chewed me out because she said, Phil, it'll be $25 today, $50, $100, and then there won't be any insurance. Guess what? If you're a new person to the state right now when you retire, guess what you don't keep? Your insurance. These younger people are going to be, they were sold out. And I think back now, Philip was wrong, and that lady that had wisdom, practical knowledge, was right. Because you gave in on one little issue. So sometimes I think it just depends on, how important that it is. And so it's worldly wisdom. If you look at the top here on 17, it says, there is a better choice. The adjective James applies here to wisdom is from above, the wisdom from above. It calls Paul the list of fruit of the Spirit. Most of these terms are clear because they use a manner that is consistent with the other writers of the New Testament. It says, easy to be entreated means something like willing to yield, open to reason. To be without partiality goes hand in hand without having hypocrisy. I mean, you have to think about the choices you make. You can't say, I don't even want to go there. I was going to bring up something else, but it has nothing. I'll stop that. We'll talk about this wheelchair. The author writes about this wheelchair. And he says that this lady's name is going to be Judy. And in this example, he says his wife was in a wheelchair and she needed this help. And all of a sudden this part broke. And he's so upset and angry about it. And they said they'd order the part and it'd be 3 weeks. And he raised his cane. And before you know it, they get, and he's rude to them and they give in and said they'll have the part. Then all of a sudden that part doesn't work and he wants a new wheelchair and they said they'll have to order it and it'll be a couple weeks. But he finally is just so rude and obnoxious to these people. They send this lady out named Judy. And Judy sits down and she is so nice. And she explains things in a calm way. And all of a sudden he starts thinking, I have been a jerk. He's trying to be a pastor. Or, he's trying to be a religious person. And he's thinking everything, because this is important to me, I'm blaming this person, and I shouldn't be. I'm being a hypocrite. I'm saying have this peace and patience and love, and I'm being a jerk. And he said, at the end, he said, you're one of two things in life. Either you are Judy or you need a Judy, okay? Most of the time, Philip needs a Judy, okay? I need the Judy to say, Philip, come here, please. Think about what's coming out of your mouth, please. I need a Judy. But luckily, the Lord gives us some Judys, the people that calm you down and let you see things, down the road. And I was thinking about teachers and, what you teach and what you say. And this lady was teaching Sunday school, and I had written this down. And practicing what you preach and making sure that you're clear in your responsibility to teach. And this lady took Sunday school really, really seriously. So she had been, which she should, she'd been teaching the kids about all the famous lessons in the Bible. And one Sunday she came in and she said, I'm going to have you draw a picture everything, one of your stories. And so the kids are all drawing and stuff, and she goes up to this one little girl, and she sees there's a picture of 4 people, and she kind of knows 3 of them, and they're in an airplane. And she asked the little girl, said, honey, what Bible story are you writing about, drawing about? What are you trying to tell me? And she says, well, this was the flight from Egypt. And she goes, oh, it's okay. She said, yeah. And she goes, the lady says, well, I recognize 3 of those. She goes, is that Mary? She goes, that's Mary. And she goes, is that Joseph? She said, that's Joseph. And she goes, is that baby Jesus? She said, And she said, well, who's that other one? She says, that's Pontius the Pilate. So sometimes, when you're teaching kids, you're going to be the teacher. You have to have a clear message that is understood. So Pontius the Pilate. Speaking of Pontius the Pilate, there's one time this lady that was my boss, and she would always tell me things, and make you feel bad and say, it's going to be your fault. So one Christmas, I bought her a bowl, and I gave it to her some water. She said, what's this? I said, so you can wash your hands with it every time you want to blame me. I just tried to give her a biblical reference. She could be Pontius the Pilate. Okay. So maybe it got her to go back and read her Bible. I don't know, but I did buy her the little bowl. That's what I always thought it was, wash your hands with the water. Hopefully y'all get that. All right, 18. The desired goal there at 18, the bottom is, one who seeks true wisdom is peace. The teachers may have been fostering, or at least have tried to stop conflicts amongst themselves. Those who make peace, however, said to sow in peace. The fruit of the righteous can be both what is sown and what is harvested as a cycle of peace begins. Righteousness is one's inclusive words and one's works. And I don't know about you, but as I get older, peace is what I want. I would love to go through a week with no arguments, no confrontations, no upset, just have peace. And if I can mediate between people and have peace, I'm all for that. Now, I think when you're younger, maybe you're more combative or more argumentative. As you get older, I don't want any arguments. I would like just to be able to talk it out, because our lives would be so much better. And I think fostering that peace, and that does come with maturity at some point. There's a point where you just want peace. And I think peace is important to you as you get older. Now, one of the things is the persecution in here, and this is how James kind of starts turning this. In number 2 on the persecution, there's these landlords, okay? And he starts talking about there are strong arguments can be made in this chapter or these verses. He's speaking against landlords who are unbelievers. We notice that they are not called to repent, but to weep and howl in the light of the coming judgment. These landlords are treating them terrible. And James is saying, I know he didn't even call for them to repent because they're complete unbelievers. He'd like to see them change, but they're not. So he says, I know you're being mistreated by these landlords, but he's talking to these people who are being mistreated. He said, such landlords come from a handful of rich outsiders who would make life miserable for many of the tenant farmers and the day laborers. It is unlikely that such landlords would even hear or read the words themselves. Instead, the accusations are written for the benefit of the impoverished Christians. James is not writing to the landlords. He's writing to the people who are suffering at the hands of these landlords. That's who he's writing to. And one of these things is not what we're going to want to hear. You can see the next in A. Be what? Patient. And I think this is going to be the hardest thing, is that if these landlords are cruel and you're suffering through it, God's not going to put more on you than you can handle. That's biblical. But at the same time, if these landlords are not going to adjust and change, you don't need to worry about judgment, because it's coming their direction one day. Now, it may not be on your time schedule. It might not be when you want them to be punished. It might not be when you want the deed to be settled. And I always go back to Eric preaching in the book of Revelation. It meant so much to me when all those martyrs go back and said, Leo, they tell God, the martyrs that have already died, and I'm going to paraphrase it, when are you going to take revenge for us? Basically they're saying, we died for you, in your name. And he said, you're going to have to give time for another season. Eventually it'll happen. Even they didn't have the patience. They didn't know the timeline. And he said, it will come, but it'll be in another season. And I think that was hard for them to hear, but it's never going to be in your timeline. Matter of fact, it's almost never going to be on your timeline. And I always heard, I heard a pastor when I was younger, Ray Hall, I don't know if you know
Ray Hall, when I was a boy, that was one of my pastors. When I was a little boy, he said that people always pray and pray and pray, and they want this and they want that and they want it right now. And it's like, the cat telling the little mouse or little hamster you've got. He was saying, once out of that cage, once out of that cage, and you tell the hamster, nope, can't let you out. But the hamster, out. I want it now. I want my freedom now. And you say, okie dokie, but I'm telling you, it's not in your best interest, but I'll just give you what you want. You let the hamster out, and he don't see the cat around the corner, and he gets killed. He was using this, something that a child can understand. You don't know what's around the corner. You don't understand the timeline. You don't understand the reasons. And it's not for you to understand, it's simply for you to follow. If the Lord tells you no, not now, take His words, there's a good reason for it. You don't know what's around that corner that might get you. Sometimes I've asked for things, me personally, and the Lord has told me no, and I've been bitter about it. I mean, I'm just being honest with you. At that time, I was upset because I thought, I'm just telling you what I think. I have done everything I'm supposed to do. I have asked for your help. I have prayed about it. I have done the things I need to do, and I don't think it's right. And maybe I'm the only person that's ever either thought it. And even if you don't say it, if it goes through your brain, the Lord knows it anyway. And I thought that. And then 2 or 3 years later, I'm thinking, Lord, thank you for not giving me what I asked for, buddy, because you did me the biggest favor of all time. But at that time, I was bitter about it because I didn't have any patience. And I didn't see what was around that corner. And thankfully, the Lord didn't give me what I want. But I will say sometimes He will give you what you want to your own detriment. I always think of them, Israel wanting a king. We need a king. We need a king. We need a king. No, you don't. Yes, we do. No, we don't. All right, I'll give you one. Boy, Saul did them a bunch of big favors, didn't he? I mean, you didn't need him. He was already there, but he gave them what they kept asking for. And sometimes it's good and sometimes it's bad, but you did it to yourself. And I think many times we're just like the children of Israel. We ask for things that we think we need and want, and I'm one of them. And then luckily, though, sometimes the Lord doesn't give me those things, especially some jobs I've asked for. I've prayed and asked for different jobs, and I think this is the best, and I want this now, and I've done all this work, and I am so thankful to the Lord Almighty that He turned me down. And I was bitter about it, and I think He knows I'm bitter about it. He knows what's in my heart. He knew I was angry about it. And yet He still looked out for me. Now, I'm going to tell you, you ever had your own child, and they just keep asking and asking and asking, and you know it's not for their good, and you finally say, go ahead, just do it. And you know what's going to happen when they go do it. They're going to get hurt, right? And the Lord has got so much mercy. A lot of times with my parents, they come back and say, I told you so. The Lord just says, He welcomes you right back in. And that's the difference between humans and the Lord. But they're talking about this. Now, one thing's going to happen here with patience. He talks about something that I've mentioned before too, the long view. James points out the oppressed believers to the coming of the Lord as the ultimate solution, the long view. You suffer here on this side of eternity, and you might suffer terribly, but He's never going to put on something that you can't bear. But if you look at the long view, you're going to win the war at the end. I used to have another pastor say, man, I know we win. I read the end of the book. I know the end. But you have to look for that long view. But from here to there, there's going to be some suffering. And he's going to mention Job. A man born of a woman's life is short and full of trouble. And I don't think things have changed a lot from Job's time. There's good times and there's bad times, but there's going to be a lot of trouble times. But it doesn't mean that you're not going to win in the end if you follow the Lord. But he mentions that to him. And he said that, I thought the author was kind of funny here, though I'm going to read this. He said that James points to oppressed believers of the coming of the Lord. This might seem like a cop-out to some of the modern readers who are used to enacting change through the democratic process. I thought, not anymore. Not in America. Used to be that way, but that probably needs to be highlighted out of there. I don't know what it is sometimes now. It's insanity. It says, but we remember that the world of the first century AD had no such process. Appealing to change might have to be the conscience of those who have the power to make a change, but hope for change ultimately resides in taking the long view, which looks for the return of Christ. There was no democracy. It was one king or one ruler, and if that person didn't want to do it, it wasn't happening. I mean, that was their view. So you had to take the long view, because the chances of big change coming about was probably not going to happen. just because of the institutions that were in place on this side of eternity, the government styles man had laid out. And it was just the way that it was. The patient that requires is illustrated by the analogy of the husbandman. James talks now about a farmer having to look. And if you're a farmer, I know my aunt and uncle that lived in Missouri were always farmers. They would come and visit us. It was my mom's sister and her husband. And they would come, and he was a farmer, and he was constantly on the phone. Has there been any flooding? Have we got rain? It was always something. And he had to take the long view because, sometimes it rains, sometimes it don't, sometimes it rains too much. You're always on edge. And you're having, and if the crop doesn't work out this year, you don't quit. You got to go do it all over again. And you got to have the long view that eventually if you work and you stay with it, that eventually it will work out in the end. And I think that's what James is saying, is that if you're like the farmer, I tried this, Lord, it didn't work, and I failed, and this didn't work. And the Lord would say, just stick with it. Just keep trying. Because eventually it will work out in the end. And I think that's for farmers, that's the idea of the farmer there, is that, and I didn't realize this too. Did you realize that they said in Israel it's quite rare for rain to fall between May 1st and October 15th? No rain. That's quite common. Folks, that's a long, I guess that's why it's a desert, right? Half the time but that's a long time without rain. Can you imagine people in our churches, a lot of times during the summer, some years, not this summer, but I've been in church before, you go 2 weeks without rain, they'll say, we're praying for rain. And I'm thinking, glad you're not in Israel, because you're going to go like months without rain. So it differs. He said it will differ by location. Yeah, no duh. On number 8, he said, just like the farmer in verse 7, James' audience was to be patient. Christians must be resolute and courageous in earthly circumstances. If you flip over, one of the things on 446 he's going to talk about, and I think this is a big problem, the people that were suffering under these landlords couldn't get to the landlords. They weren't accessible. And I think about it in a work situation. Let somebody at the high corporate is making decisions, but you never see them. And people look to blame somebody. And they typically blame the person who's right in front of them. Americans, we want to blame the people that we can see. So a lot of times you're blaming the wrong person. And what happens here amongst these people that are being persecuted, they can't get to the landowner or the landlords. So who do they start blaming and arguing with is each other. And they start, what I wrote down is that, they start having grudges and they start blaming the people they can see instead of the people that are really the enemy or the people making these evil decisions. And you do it because it's proximity. I can't blame them, but I can blame you. And sometimes you ever hear people say, you make sure you're blaming the right person. Don't go hammer the wrong person and cause. And remember, these were all brethren. They were other Christians. These just weren't people off the street. These were people that were in the Christian faith. And I think sometimes, it'd be like blaming a pastor for COVID. I mean, really, like say you wanted the service a certain way or things aren't doing a certain way. Well, COVID is this force around us that we can't see or touch. But I can see the pastor. So I'm going to blame him, and you don't think of it that way, but you're looking for somebody to blame. And so you take it out on the next person on the list, even though that might not be the person. And that was what was happening right here. These landlords were in problem. He said, listen, you're causing turmoil amongst your own brethren, your own other Christian people, and it doesn't need to be that way. And that's kind of what he's pointing out. And said, it should be tragic indeed that the judgment that God had prepared. Now I want you to listen to this, because this is so important. It would be tragic indeed if the judgment that God had prepared for the oppressors also comes on them because of their failure in this regard. So God is going to judge these people that are treating you this way, that are non-Christians. He said, is it not terrible that you're bringing these same type judgments on your own brethren that have nothing to do with it? Is that not horrible? And you're doing it to yourselves. That's kind of what James, and you don't want to get yourself in that situation. On 9b, it says, behold, the judge standeth before the door. It said, this warning implies the imminent return of the Lord, but people understand that the idea in different ways, since imminent can mean expected very soon. It can happen any time. Either understanding calls for repentance. Sin must be put aside immediately. When Christians harbor bitterness toward one another, they lose their witness. If you can't be civil and friendly with the brethren and the people at the church and other Christians, why would somebody outside that's not a Christian listen to anything you have to say? That's a common man's way of saying that statement in just practical means. If you're going to be a jerk and treat me with disrespect amongst each other in this church, why would anybody out there want to be what we are? And it's going back to practice what you preach and your witness. Your witness is just how you conduct yourself. Not that you're going to live perfect or say everything right every time, but if that's how you treat people on a week-to-week basis in the house of the Lord or amongst Christians, why would anybody else want to listen to you or follow in your footsteps? I mean, Paul basically says that in Hebrew. Remember, I've heard so many pastors say Paul wouldn't brag when he said, if you want to know how to follow the Lord, you're basically be a Christian, follow me. He wouldn't want himself to be worshipped. He was trying to provide them with a concrete example of how to best live their life day in and day out and be a Christian. And here's the thing, it wasn't just Paul's job. That's what James is getting at. Whose job is it? It's anybody that calls himself a Christian or part of the brethren. It's your responsibility. And if you can't do that, then you're going to lose your witness, and don't be surprised when you do. And I think like we talked about, it's easy to build up or hard to build up, but easy to tear down. A witness is hard to gain respect, but you can destroy it really quickly, and it happens. So, and then he starts talking about the people that were, some of the biggest people that were oppressed were prophets. And he starts talking about the prophets who were sent by God as messengers from the Lord. They have a specific message that's incredibly important that the Lord wants to get across to his people, and they talk and nobody listens. They talk and nobody listens. They warn of possible things that are coming down the pipe that's going to be terrible if we don't change, and nobody listens. So day in and day out, you've been given this job by the Lord to speak to your people as a prophet, and nobody listens. Nobody heeds the warning. And they just, here again, they wake up the next day, and what do? They do it again. They stick with it. I always think of John the Baptist, not that he was a prophet, but they always talk about simple messages. John the Baptist was repent or perish. I mean, I guess you wouldn't like to attend his church because it was the same message every week. He just got up and said, repent or perish. It's pretty straightforward, wasn't it? That was, and if you don't believe it, read John. I mean, that's the nuts and bolts of the message. Repent or perish every Sunday. Repent or perish. Repent or perish. And the Lord said there'd never been one like that on John the Baptist and never will be again. So he held him in high esteem. And that was his message simply every week. They go from the prophets. The next thing that James does, and you have to give people, if you're going to teach, practical examples. And in the Bible, that's not practical. You need to have a practical example if somebody puts you on the spot. That's what James is doing. He mentions the Israelites. He mentions the prophets. Now who does he go and mention to the people? That would be a practical example. Job. That's somebody that they would all be familiar with. And he says, look at Job, how faithful he was, and what kind of life Job lived, yet he still suffered mightily. And if you've never read the book of Job, like start to finish, do it sometime. It's unbelievable. Every time you read it, it's unbelievable that the problems that Job had, everything was taken from him. And we always think of the devil. I think Pastor Law was talking about this too, is that, the image you have and he's in hell and all that stuff. And Job, the Lord asked, where you been? He said, I've been, here to and fro, up and down. He's just been bouncing around causing problems wherever he can cause problems. And of course, he points out one of the loyal servants, Job, let me take a run at him. And Job, as a human, I don't think Job deserved that. I don't, me as a person. But it's not me making that decision. It's the Lord. And the Lord didn't put anything on Job that he said that Job couldn't handle, or you, or whoever else. And of course, Job is rewarded in the end. And when you think about the story of Job, when I was looking at this, Job is symbolic. Job has the ups and downs of life, but he has to struggle to win in the end. And in the end, that God rewards him 10 times over. But when you think about it, to me, the Lord brought it to my mind, it's symbolic, because we're going to be rewarded 10 times over, right? But where is that going to happen? In heaven. If you think of Job's life, it's symbolic. because he's living a good life. You have all these terrible ups and downs, yet he stays the course. He stays with the Lord, and in the end, he's rewarded 10 times over. Does that not sound like the story that we try to tell every Christian, is that you're going to, when they be saved, and it'll be great, but there's going to be ups and downs throughout, but you've got to stay the course, and in the end, you'll be rewarded. I mean, is that not what Job, I mean, the Lord brought that to my attention when I was reading through this. I mean, Job's life is the example of what all of our lives will be, and not to that extreme, because most of us are never going to suffer like Job suffered. He suffered to the absolute extreme. So God gives you an example, and James has given the Israelites, who they would have been familiar with Job, an example was, these landlords are mistreating you, and I'm going to act like I'm James. All right, the landlords are mistreating you, and you think everything's terrible. Are you being treated worse than Job was? I mean, that's kind of what he's saying. But Job kept the faith. I mean, that's kind of what James is saying to the Israelites. Job kept the faith, and he had the long view. And then what happened to Job in the end? He was rewarded 10 times over. So he's painting this picture for them, is that, you ever had somebody complain? You're like, well, you have no right to complain. Let me give you an example of somebody. Have you ever done that even for your own children? They're complaining about something, and you say, you don't even know what a complaint really is. Let me give you an example. And that's what James is doing with something that would have been very pertinent to them, and it would have been Job. If you look at number 12 there, he says, Jesus appears by name only twice in this letter. James regularly, though, alludes to his teachings, particularly it is recorded in his Sermon on the Mount. The verse before us offers the clearest connection in that regard, which features a direct quotation. It says, this verse before us offers the clearest connection in the regard which features quotation. It says, elsewhere the teachings of Jesus bubble just below the surface of James' discussions. The verse at hand caps off all of this section of James' letter. The phrase, but above all things, implies the swearing of oaths is the most egregious of the original readers could engage in. And he starts talking about an oath and why that's a bad thing. But he starts talking about the conclusion here. He said, today's lesson brings two desperate passages together under one unifying theme: the supremacy of the wisdom from above and the need for it in a variety of situations. Teachers then as now can wreak great spiritual damage through the outspoken word among those they teach. Ordinary believers suffering greatly under economic oppression neglect the gospel and its power by harboring bitterness against fellow Christians. The solution for Christians is to seek wisdom from above. When armed with that, they can put suffering into a larger perspective and empowered with the patience to endure until Jesus returns. We all face challenges over the course of our lives. The real question is how we react when those times come. Will we pause and seek wisdom from above, or will we rely on earthly wisdom in our response? How are you going to react to the down times? When things are not really going the way that you want it, like these Israelites are going with these landlords, are you going to be bitter with other people around you? Are you going to blame the wrong people? Are you going to lose your witness because you're going to get angry and take it out on other people and act in an unchristian, unchrist-like manner and lose your witness? And you're doing it to your own detriment, and you're not taking the long view that eventually things are going to work out. You will be rewarded. I think that James, when you look at him as a speaker, I always think, if I would have been James, remember the brother of Christ, I would always had some deep feelings of regret if I'd have been James, because of his unbelief in his brother about what the message was. But I think that those feelings that James had and those mistakes drove him to be the person. He used those shortcomings to become a powerful messenger for the word of Christ. I always think of Peter. Man, Peter was aggressive. I think Peter was the guy that would act first and think later. And I think his heart was in the right place. But when he said he wouldn't turn against, talk against the Lord, and the Lord said, you won't deny me thrice, and he does that, I think that drove Peter, though, after Christ was crucified. I think it drove him the rest of his life. So sometimes I think that your biggest mistake or your biggest shortcoming could also be the biggest driving force in your life for Christ. It could be something that Christ He allowed you to be put in that situation, and He allowed you failed. You didn't succeed. But through that failure, you could have your greatest success in the end by taking the long view. You failed miserably in this spot, but you used that to impact the rest of your life as a Christian in a positive way. And I think sometimes you have to look back, and you kind of feel shame sometimes when you come short of the glory of God. Those guys are examples, but that's just that you can use it to your benefit. I saw that we had a meeting tonight, and did you see it for a business meeting this evening? And you call meetings sometimes, that's how I'll finish up. Sometimes you got to be careful, when you set meetings about how you say things, and what you say. There's a pastor, and he gets up and says, when the service is over, I need to meet with the church board for a few minutes after the service is over. And so when the service is over, the church board's down here, and they're all together, and there's one guy sitting there, and he's just visiting the church, but he's sitting with them. Everybody else is gone. And they asked the man, they said, sir, the service is over. You're free to leave. This is just for the church board. And he said, no, I'm in the right place. And they said, no, you don't understand. This is just for the church board. You really can't be here. And he said, I don't understand what the problem is. They said, what do you mean? He said, I sat through the service just like all of you, and I'm as bored as the rest of you. So I want to make sure I sit here and get my point across. So when you have a meeting, make sure that it's explicit about what you're talking about. So if you say the church board, make sure that you know it's what you're talking about. Everybody with me here? Okay. I appreciate it. Next week, we'll start that the new planner or the new Sunday school. And there were some of them in the rooms, is that not correct? So if you want to get one, that's like a little